All right. So I know many of you know me already. I'm Marini Allen, and I'm the director of the Institute for Classics Education. We're a 501c3 nonprofit in the US, and our mission is to provide free resources and support to teachers and learners of ancient Greek culture and texts. My email and website, I'll put those in the chat. And for now, I'm really so happy to have Ben Cassel back. Ben is a PhD candidate with the Department of Classics, King's College London, where his research is focused on the cognitive impact of Athenian religious experience. He is the author of a number of papers, an editor with the Journal of Cognitive Historiography, and the winner of the Grote Prize in Ancient History. He is also about to begin a 3-month research placement with the University of Trento relating to cultural memory in ancient Greece. Thank you so much, Ben, for coming back and illuminating us again.
Thank you for having me again, Irene. Sometimes it's only when you hear your bios you realize just how little time you actually have. Yes, thank you again for the invitation to be speaking to you and your wonderful audience again. And for those returning names again, it's nice to see that I didn't scare you off the first time. It's St. David's Day here in Wales, so I'd like to say to everyone, Dydd Gwyl dwi hapus in Welsh, and Croeso fawr iawn pawb. So a very warm welcome to everyone in the audience. Other than that, I should share my screen and find my PowerPoint. Here we go. I've got too many tabs open. That's my problem.
A familiar.
Yeah. Is it appearing for you?
No.
No?
I just see black for right now, black screen, and it says you've
Okay.
started sharing. Ah, there it is.
Is it there? Okay.
Yeah.
I can't see you, but I'll begin anyway. So yeah, again, thank you for the invitation, and I'll get going. So in a slight diversion from the title, I won't be discussing the differences between the Athenian and the Sicilian manifestations of the Thesmophoria too much in this talk, because you need not know, and actually in some of the slides it's signaled anyway. If you are interested, there's a fantastic article by an author called Catherine McGlardy in an edited volume by Hans Beck and Julia Kint, which I'd recommend to anyone interested in this. But in the questions, there's a mountain of bibliography on this festival, so we could go over it there. So the Thesmophoria was one of the most widespread festivals of Greek antiquity, being attested from Sicily to Libya. It was a well-known festival comprised of various secret rites performed exclusively by women, and is usually discussed in the scholarship in terms of its relating to agricultural and personal fertility. The general notion that it was an identity-affirming event is also repeated a good deal. So my aim here today is not to directly argue against these interpretations, but to rather sensitize them to how the experiences of the Thesmophoria would affect their participants. Primarily, I argue that the festival's rites align with the model of decentering and the divided self in religious ritual. This process is argued as facilitating the cognitive conditions by which ritual encourages collective beliefs, morals, and identities to be adopted. So before I move on to the next slide and describe decentering and the divided self a little bit, here's an overview of at least the Athenian or the Attic version of the Thesmophoria. You can see that it went on for a number of days. The last event, which we'll get to later in the paper, I'm not sure when or where that happened. It's a bit of a mystery, but we love those. But more or less, the main body of the festival was the 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th of Paenopsion, so in the autumn, the Athenian autumn. So decentering. So decentering and religious cognition is a particular model developed and argued by someone called Patrick McNamara. It's composed over 4 stages that are said to happen to varying degrees in different religious contexts, obviously. And the 4 steps are as such. In the first step, the self-concept is diminished through a loss of personal agency, through social stressors, discrepancies between pre-existing beliefs and present actions. In the second stage, the self-concept is placed in a liminal space where it can be updated and edited through sensory data. And this sensory data is often experienced as what is titled in the literature as imaginative events. So we can guess how that goes. The third stage, individuals update this self-concept by drawing on memories, the experiential environment, i.e. what's happening immediately in and around them, and the cultural scripts relevant to the immediate social group or religious ritual, i.e., what narrative is being commemorated, evoked, or literally told, sung about. The fourth stage, this new self-concept becomes embodied and socially reconstructed. So in essence, the decentering model argues that a diminished self-concept allows for ritual participants to pick up a larger array of information in their sensory and cultural surround, use cognitive resources that are likewise used in critical thinking, are then impacted. So the self-concept relies on cultural scripts to repair itself, if that makes any sense, but we'll get into it later on. So rather than simply providing an identity affirming experience through participation alone, I argue that Thesmophoria aligns with this model and thus produce conditions by which a strong self-concept is actually taken offline. What we are able to reconstruct of this festival's experiential conditions suggests this decentering process and would have allowed for an embodied interaction with Demeter's emotive states and possibly her epiphanic appearance. Indeed, from this decentered state, Demeter as an agent of civilizing order and fertility would provide the most relevant cultural script by which participants reconstructed their self-concept in late stages of step 3 and step 4 here. So let's get to the festival itself. The first primary day is the Adonos, the going up. And it would have marked a movement away from the home and a movement into a sanctuary of Demeter. This would have been different in each polis, in each deme, and in Athens, it's argued that this was the Thesmophorion, which has yet to be identified. I have contending opinion, but again, maybe that can come out in the questions. Several restrictions on dress, diet, and behavior are generally argued as coming into effect alongside this migration rather. Sexual intercourse was prohibited for at least several days prior, and a limited diet of sesame cakes was probably followed on the 11th of Pinopsion. We should also not rule out the possibility that bathing was prohibited, which is actually suggested in Callimachus's, the Homeric hymn to Demeter rather. While no explicit restrictions on dress appear in classical Athenian sources, it is possibly suggested in the ban on flower and garlands, and in the Peloponnese, ornate robes, makeup, and jewelry were certainly banned. In Sicily, women's dress, mimicked the ancient way of life. And in Callimachus's hymn to Demeter, they marched in procession with loose hair and bare feet. The widespread adoption of a restricted dress code during the Thesmophoria would suggest that this was also the case in Athens. Now, this plain dress code and the exclusion of makeup and jewelry is often discussed in terms of its relating to notions of the ideal wife and an attempt at desexualization during the first 2 days of the festival. However, we should not ignore its acting within a ritual context where aspects of Demeter's sadness and losing Persephone rather, were directly imitated. Indeed, in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, the grief-stricken goddess destroys her headdress and throws away her dark blue cloak, abandoning her regular attire and adopting an appropriately mournful image. That loose hair was synonymous with mourning in Athens, need not be emphasized here. I argue that the various behavioral restrictions that frame the initiation of the Thesmophoria would have enabled the first stage of the decentering process. Required conformity to specific bodily practices and dress suggests the kind of social pressures that can begin to erode a strong sense of self. Likewise, homogeneity of appearance and action is a major factor in generating feelings of entity. the sensation of group cohesion, and in this instance was likely considered as imitating the grief-stricken state of Demeter. So the second day, the nestia. This is even more an element. This is an even more evident element on Thesmophoria's second day. So these processes are here evident in that participants conducted an all-day fast or sitting on mats made of herbs understood as alleviating sexual desire. They also adopted a depressed and mournful mood. Plutarch says that the Athenian women conducted their fast by sitting on the ground, and Aristophanes also emphasizes its being very solemn. In effect, participants imitated Demeter's depressed state after the abduction of Persephone. However, rather than being an artificial reenactment, the physical, emotional, and dietary restraint of the second day would support an embodied interaction with this myth and the figure of Demeter. Importantly, the experience of the fast would in fact engender depressed emotional states among gathered women. Reduced blood glucose decreases attention capacity, while also inducing feelings of fatigue and reduced motivation. Hunger, even in the short term, activates amplified negative emotions while adversely impacting effective judgment and the interpretation of sensory information. Hunger-induced emotional negativity is also contextually salient, that is to say, shaped by external circumstances. Dehydration also impacts energy and concentration levels while contributing to feelings of tension. So rather than just seeing this as a imitative or purificatory aspect, fasting and the lack of drinking during the nestia would have helped to generate a genuinely sullen mood among participants, while the contextual cue of imitating Demeter would frame how it was interpreted. In effect, the feelings of the goddess would inform those of the participants. By sitting on the ground, participants would also likely experience feelings of passive weight, slumped shoulders, and general discomfort, sensations that characterize movements performed with minimal energy expenditure. From an evolutionary psychological perspective, adopting postures that enclose the frame of the body and slump the shoulders have been shown to more readily produce feelings of sadness. While our knowledge of these ritual acts is rudimentary, the realities of completing a fast while seated on the ground indicate how participants of the Thesmophoria would be more likely to experience the emotive states of the episode they were reenacting. But rather than simply mimicking Demeter, they would have provided conditions by which to feel the emotional state of the goddess. The experience of fasting while in a physically restrained position again aligns with the conditions of decentering. Again, a strong self-concept would be eroded by the prescribed bodily emotive states of these rites, which would have been experienced with a degree of discomfort. Likewise, the impact of hunger and dehydration is suggestive of the second stage, where the diminished ego experiences incoming sensory information as imaginative. From the perspective of embodied cognition, which we'll move on to in a little more detail later on, the Thesmophoria can be said to have manipulated the bodily experiences of its participants in such a way as to generate particular mental emotive states. How the body is directed to move, react in a given ritual context is essential in its transmitting abstract propositions, such as behavioral ideas. Indeed, even moral systems are argued as emerging primarily in the sensorimotor systems of the body. In this instance, the cognitive effects of fasting and sitting on the ground would mean participants would experience an emotive state of a deity they were calling on to guarantee the continued agricultural and personal fertility of the polis. More on this in a moment. So, schema discrepancy. The sedate quality of the second day would be broken with sexualized jesting, which again imitated Demeter's lifting mood after being similarly teased. In Athens, women also threw insults at one another 2 days prior to the Thesmophoria, a festival called the Stania, which was also conducted at night and was accompanied by sacrifices to Demeter and Persephone. The terms used to describe the types of insults and language used in these two rites is quite revealing. It is more often described in terms of coarse jesting, but the terms loidreo and blasphemo likewise suggest more pointed verbal attacks. In particular, the use of blasphemo can relate to personalized slandering. As well as providing a sharp break from the apparently gloomy mood, the use of this language can contribute to the decentering process as it directly contradicted the ideal behavioral expectations for women, as well as when they were inside sacred space, something even evident in Aristophanes. Women that performed the Thesmophoria were also called bees, a title argued as relating to the image of the ideal woman as being domestically active and sexually placid. Indeed, the bee woman is a model of fertility. All things grow at her hands, yet she takes no joy in sitting among women and speaking about sex. Where the bee woman of Simonides avoids sexual talk, the bees of the Thesmophoria fully embraced it. As such, the use of foul language while inside the Thesmophorian would mean experience a discrepancy between otherwise authoritative behavioral standards and present action. Again, in relation to the decentering model, discrepancies in a ritual environment that call the world or personal identity into question are a core element in eroding a strong self-concept. While I don't mean to suggest that the use of this language was any way distressing for the women performing at the Thesmophoria, would have been well aware of its breaking with convention. Similarly, we should not ignore the potential that this language had the potential to be an embarrassing experience, something that would again contribute to the cognitive conditions of stage one in the decentering process. Again, in the context of the Stanier at least, it would seem personal drives could be quite pointed. While obviously mediated by context, public embarrassment elicits heightened physiological responses, such as increased heart rate and the adoption of so-called appeasement gestures, including avoiding eye contact. Experiencing embarrassment likewise utilizes cognitive resources used for processing the self-image and emotional regulation. In essence, it requires a readjustment of the self-concept in response to situational stress. That both these rites were likely held during the nighttime or pre-dawn would also contribute to this cognitive downregulation, with incoming sensory information being unclear. While more obscure, the use of foul language may have been accompanied by the use of a moraton, a whip made out of bark, which, along with the sexual language, is often discussed in terms of its being a mechanism to promote fertility. But we know nothing about this supposed bark whip that they went around hitting each other with, sadly. So, taken together, the rites of the Thesmophoria indicate a set of experiences that manipulated the body and emotive states via prescribed actions, while also breaking culturally expected behaviors in relation to both gender and the context of a sacred space. So far, then, various aspects of the festival are indicated as aligning with a ritualized erosion of a strong self-concept among participants. As a consequence of both this decentering process and specific environmental physiological conditions, I argue that the Thesmophoria would have provided an experiential platform that could have allowed for the epiphanic appearance of the twin goddesses. So Aristophanes' Women of the Thesmophoria is a key source here, and while his version of the festival was, of course, fundamentally ill-informed, aspects of the ritual framework presented here do find correspondence elsewhere. Set towards the end of the second day, the Nestia, the chorus declare that the time to perform the secret rites on behalf of the goddesses has come around again. They then begin a fast-paced, nimble, and disorientating dance while still fasting. They do this in order to make the goddesses laugh and smile. Indeed, the feast with which they will break their fast can only come after these dances are sung, after these dances and sung evocations are complete. This reaches its crescendo at lines 1148 to 57, where the goddesses are called upon to reveal themselves and come into the midst of the torch-lit rites. That a particular dance was performed during the Thesmophoria is indicated by several other sources. While late, Hesychius mentions a dance titled Botrida, ascribed to the Thesmophoria, and a panicus is performed in conjunction with Demeter, revealing herself in the Homeric hymn to the goddess. That some rites took place at night is also evidenced in Herodotus. Similarly, the approach of a procession of torch-wielding women entering the temple at line 281 in Callimachus's hymn to Demeter likewise signals a nighttime ritual activity. Importantly, in terms of Callimachus, it has been argued that the Thesmophoria practiced in Alexandria during the 3rd century BC directly imitated the Athenian model, meaning that his hymn may depict some general elements of the Athenian version. And a procession is mentioned by Isaiah 650. The torchlit evocations of the goddesses at lines 1148 in Aristophanes and the nighttime welcoming of Demeter in Callimachus's hymn, both of which are explicitly conducted on the second day of the Thesmophoria, do point towards a similar ritual context. The experiential environment suggested by these sources, even at the most basic level, indicates conditions by which precipitate something called agency detection. Agency detection is the habit by which humans perceive the presence of beings in their immediate environment, even where there is none, including faces in clouds, etc. In ritual contexts, where the space and action suggest the presence of such agents, their detection rises exponentially. Unreliable sensory data is key to this process, while pre-existing beliefs and contextual cues determine whether the presence will be sensed in such conditions. The evocation of the goddesses presented by Aristophanes is most certainly performed in an unreliable sensory environment. It is nighttime and torchlit setting. Participants are engaged in a fast-paced dance, while the effects of low blood sugar would mean reduced cognitive performance and difficulty in concentrating. It is torchlight that in fact means that is in fact the means by which Demeter and Persephone appear, bringing them to light in a quasi-physical sense. Moreover, participants of the Thesmophoria would have been overtly primed to detect the presence of these goddesses in their environment. Even discounting the passage of Aristophanes, any nighttime evocation of the goddesses would have operated in tandem with participants' experiences over the previous day, where they would have imitated Demeter through their dress, diet, and physical emotive states. Similarly, studies examining how religious spaces induce behavioral changes have identified that environments understood as being sacred often produce a feeling of being watched by superhuman beings. This again relates to our default cognition of detecting agency in our immediate proximity. In this instance, where the goddesses are directly asked to appear in a torchlit context of a sanctuary in order to witness secret rites no man can see, their detection would be strongly encouraged. These passages thus present us with a confluence of sensory cognitive conditions which lend themselves to agency detection and could thus contribute to an experience of sharing the environment with Demeter and Persephone. Indeed, the evocation of the goddesses in Aristophanes must of course be approached with caution. However, the framework of a nighttime setting, dancing and welcoming Demeter does find parallel in other sources. And even if this presentation represents a basic framework of genuine rites, it is significant. The goddesses are evoked at a point where participants would be the most physiologically exhausted and cognitively depleted. In relation to the decentering model, any form of interaction with a superhuman agent, such as a god, a ghost, an angel, is enabled by and contributes to a diminished self-agency of the worshipper. As these superhuman agents are inherently ascribed enhanced power and universal values, our relationship with them can only be asymmetrical. In this case, the dependency on Demeter for agricultural and personal fertility was seemingly fundamental. As such, if agency detection was experienced during the Thesmophoria, it would contribute to positioning the identity of the participants in a liminal space from which it could be edited in line with relevant cultural scripts and the immediate ritual group. The second stage of the decentering model is characterized by being flooded with sensory impressions, which can be experienced as imaginative events, scenarios. This finds strong resonance with how epiphany is described in Greek antiquity. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, her revelation is accompanied by a change in the goddess's height, a powerful smell, and multifaceted, all-encompassing light. This in turn stimulates reverence, awe, fear, becoming speechless, and physical shaking. More importantly, any experience of epiphany would inform the reconfiguration of the self-concept in line with relevant cultural scripts, so stage 4. Again, any attachments to superhuman agents are based on dependency, with any and all interactions between it and worshipper likely to elicit intense emotional commitment to their associated values over long periods of time. Indeed, seeking to gain their favor can also contribute to the decentering process, with the diminished self-concept then attempting to bind itself to the identity of the superhuman agent. As the wonderful Georgia Petrodou has stated, Epiphany was a religious experience that shook the foundations of old identity structures, allowing for the establishment of new self-concepts. The decentering model indicates the cognitive processes that would indeed underpin these types of personal transformation during epiphanic experiences, with a divided self-concept adopting traits associated with the divinity into a reconfigured identity. In a context where the mood and behavior of Demeter had been imitated on an embodied level, this relational sense of unity between the identity of participants and the values ascribed to the goddess is obvious. So rather than being related to female fertility simply at a symbolic level, the Thesmophoria would have allowed for the self-concept of its participants to merge with that of Demeter Thesmophoros, the provider of abundant agricultural yields. So, I wanted to add this as well. This is a plaque from the Eleusinion on the north slope of the Acropolis, and it complements the image, I think, in the last slide, with the worshipper, so that the red figure depiction here likely shows the episode from the hymn to Demeter. So the epiphanies happened, and the worshipper has gotten into a crouched position, and we have a similar thing from the Eleusinion from the north slope of the Acropolis, where we have Demeter seated and Persephone standing, the slave likely holding the child, and the worshipper again experiencing the goddess at such an intense level that she's been brought to her knees. But in any case, returning to this wonderful grid, the decentering model, we can see an array of experiences that would have been characterized by an embodied interaction with Demeter's mood. So let's fill it in. And here are the relevant stages in terms of the decentering model. So this interaction and embodiment of Demeter's mood and is potentially or almost certainly ripe environment for the direct interaction with the goddesses would have been stimulated by the cognitive effects of fasting and sitting on the floor. The potential detection of the goddesses at the end of this day would be supported by its sensory environment, the cognitive effects of the festival's preceding rites. So we need to see this as an accumulative process. You know, you've got this is happening over a course of days. You have an array of different emotive and sensory experiences, and of course the blood sugar, which we've rested on, sort of building up to the finale of the evening of the second day, where dancing at high speed in the dark would have been a ripe environment by which to see the goddesses. So now we get to the mystery. A major absence from my reconstruction is the so-called chamber rite, primarily because its timing in relation to the other days of the Thesmophoria is very unclear. In fact, it's completely unclear. However, I will briefly note how it would contribute to the decentering process, and maybe we could talk a little bit more about its chronological location in the questions. So the chamber rite is described in depth in the Scholion to Lucian, where it is directly related to the abduction of Persephone and the death of Eubulus, who was a unwitting um, pig herder who fell into the moor left by Hades, emerging up into the world to kidnap Persephone, and he was taken down with his pigs. I've spared you having to read the entire Scholium. Otherwise, it would have been one of those awful slides where it's just a wall of text. So I've broken it down for you. Piglets at an unknown date were thrown into chambers, megara, then retrieved at some unknown point later on, with the remains then used as a sacred compost. The entire sequence of events is explicitly described as being concerned with fertility by the Scholium. So what I want to underline here is how the women charged with gathering up this compost are suggested as dealing with particularly foul liquid, suggesting a potential experience of disgust. Feelings of disgust, as well as the juxtaposition between being pure in relation to the Thesmophoria as a whole and dealing with semi-decomposed remains, would have a cognitive impact that aligns with the first two stages of the decentering model. So only a small number of women would have been able to have performed it. Yeah, maybe we can get into it in the questions, but there's a number of problems with the archaeology that is cited in relation to this rite and the Scholion. The two don't marry very well, but overall, as a satellite rite in relation to the Thesmophoria, it would have, in purposes of this paper, contributed to the first two stages. So whoever was performing this, either before or afterwards, it would have helped erode that strong self-concept. So some brief conclusions. By considering how the rites of the Thesmophoria were experienced, not just what they symbolized, we are afforded novel perspectives on how the festival would inform the identities and beliefs of its participants. Various aspects of the Thesmophoria suggest ritual conditions that align with the decentering process, where a strong sense of self would actually be impeded. While obviously imitative of Demeter, the use of beauty clothing, fasting, and sitting on the ground would have produced physiological and cognitive states that would have encouraged an embodied experience of the goddess's own physiological and emotive states. The effects of these proscribed behaviors, combined with the sensory conditions of a nighttime evocation, likewise suggest the conditions that would allow for her epiphanic experience and thus aid in the reconstruction of the self-identities of participating women. I will leave it at that and say thank you. But before I go, I do want to alert everyone here to, if you are interested in these approaches at all, the MPAGR working group, of which I am a proud member, we're a collaborative working group of scholars at various career stages, from student up to professor. I can vouch for every single person in that group being a wonderful human being. But we are focused on an array of differing and intersecting theoretical approaches to ancient Greek religion, from the Bronze Age up to the classical and Hellenistic period. So if you're interested, I can put the link to the website in the chat. Do get in touch. We're in the process of organising several events. We've had some conference panels already, and we'll have more to say in the future as well. But for now, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ben. And please do put the website in the chat if you don't mind.
No, of course.
I'm going to stop the recording now, and then we can take some questions, and anyone who's watching this afterward is also welcome to put comments or questions that we'll follow up on as much as possible.